Welcome everyone to this year's Neglected Disease launch report for the GFinder project. I'm just waiting for a few more people to join. We're delighted to have you all join us here today. My name is Dr Lindsay Keir and I am the Director of Science and Policy at Policy Cures Research, and I will be your host today. As we are all joining, I will quickly run through some housekeeping just to keep us right and steer us well through today's event. Please note we are recording this event, and that is so that we can share it with you all afterwards, but also so that we can share it with those who couldn't join in person today. As you join the meeting, you will be automatically put on mute. We would appreciate it if you could keep your microphone switched off during the course of the meeting, just so that we can ensure the best quality of sound for everyone. We will have time for questions, and so if you do want to ask a question in the meeting, if you can raise your hand, I will come to you and invite you to unmute at that appropriate time. If you don't feel comfortable asking your question live, please do feel free to put it in the Q&A box that you will see at the top of your screen. I will then ask it on your behalf. We also would love to see the people that are joining us today, so don't feel you have to keep your camera off. Do turn it on so that we can see all your lovely faces as we're talking, as it's much more motivating than talking to a black screen. Thank you very much. For anyone who needs some support and would like to use captions or subtitles through the event, you can access this by clicking on the three dots at the top of your screen and turning on live captions. You can also turn them off whenever you need to as well. If you have any technical difficulties throughout the event, please do contact us via email. Emmanuel, our communications lead, will put the email address in the chat box right now. But it is gfinder@Policy Cures Research if anyone needs this. So now that the housekeeping is out the way and we have a great number of people joining us, I will turn to the main event. So as I said, we are all here today for the launch of the 16th GFinder Neglected Disease R&D report. Over the next hour, on behalf of the whole Policy Cures Research team, we will be sharing some of the key findings of this year's report. But before we dive in, and I hand over to another colleague to talk about those, there are two key updates that I wanted to draw your attention to for this year. Firstly, after we successfully launched our new infectious disease research and development pipeline tracker back in October last year, we're really pleased to have a dedicated section on the pipeline included in this year's report for each disease area we cover. The tracker is also freely available on our website, and we'll be sending you a link so that you can peruse it at your leisure after the event. We're also really open to feedback, so if you do have any comments about this, please do let us know. Secondly, as you may know, the GFinder survey is a retrospective look at the funding that has already been dispersed or paid out in the previous financial year. So today, our focus will be talking about the 2022 financial data. This delay makes sure that all the data is as accurate as possible, but it comes with a time delay, and we're very conscious of this and have been aware of feedback from the broader community on some of the frustrations that are connected to this. So to respond to this feedback in an attempt to shorten this delay, we will now be providing earlier access to funding announcements via a new project that we're collecting data on in real time. This is called Compass, and it will now be a new feature on our GFinder data portal. And again, you can explore that at your leisure after this event. It will also be referenced throughout the report, so you'll see us mentioning that as you get through our report. So with those exciting announcements, I'm now going to turn to our main event, which is diving into the details and the key findings of this year's report. I'm delighted to have with me today two speakers whose bios were shared with you in the pre-event material. And first of all, we're going to be hearing from Paul Barnsley, who is our research and analysis lead at Policy Cures Research. Paul has led much of the development of this year's report and is going to be talking us through the key findings. Following Paul's overview, we will also hear from our keynote speaker, Shingai Machingaidze, who's the Acting Chief Scientific Officer at Africa CDC. Shingai is an epidemiologist and public health specialist with a strong track record in clinical trials and a champion for African science. We're really delighted to have Shingai as our keynote speaker today, and she'll be sharing her own personal reflections on this year's neglected disease report. As I mentioned at the start, we will be having questions after both of our speakers have talked. And so please, as you're listening, feel free to add any questions that come up into the Q&A box, or have your hand ready to be raised when we come to the discussion section thereafter. But let's now turn our attention to why we're all here today and the key findings of this year's GFINDER Neglected Disease Report. Paul, I'm going to pass over to you to share those key findings.
That's great. Thanks very much, Lindsay. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that. Okay. So last year we complained that global funding for neglected disease R&D had been basically stagnant since it peaked in 2018. We'd seen participation adjusted funding rise by 22% over the 3 years to 2018, and then drop by a total of just 4% over the next 3. 2022 represented a significant departure from that trend, but not a good one. Funding fell by a record 10%, with net participation and the set of diseases basically unchanged. We did add yours, that's the skin disease, not the possessive pronoun, to our list of neglected disease. And yours received a grand total of $0 of funding in 2022, which is depressing news for sufferers, but also very frustrating for me personally. Here's a quick look at which disease areas saw the biggest changes. Please go to the report if you want more detail about any of these. This is mostly just to give you a general sense of where the money stopped going. Now, this drop is a bit different from, say, the 6% fall in global funding we saw back in 2010, which was when the one-year sugar rush from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act went away. Mostly what happened this time around was that inflation got really out of hand, and funding wasn't set up to keep pace. If we look at the actual quantity of dollars, pounds, and euros dispersed in 2022, that's nominal funding for those of you who made it through Econ 101. The total was down by only about 3%, which feels more like continued stagnation than any sudden decline. The remaining 7% was because we adjust our measure of funding every year to take into account changes in its buying power, what economists call real funding. Let's have a look at the consequences of that approach. Over time, you can see, adjusting for inflation makes a pretty big difference to measured funding, and that gap got much bigger in 2022. Now, how worried should we be about a drop in funding that's mostly just inflation? Well, partly that depends on whether we're doing a good job measuring how changing prices actually affect the buying power of R&D funding. We use an index of consumer prices, the CPI, but product developers aren't ordinary consumers. They buy different things, more lab coats and much less butter. The US NIH deals with this problem by creating its own price index for the things it buys. This NIH index shows that R&D costs went up less than other parts of the economy, by 4.9% compared to the overall 7% consumer price inflation across the US. So the drop in real NIH funding was probably a bit smaller than we've calculated, and that might well be true of other funders in other countries as well. Why didn't we just use the NIH price index then? Mostly because it's pretty specific to the NIH. It turns out that most of the change in R&D costs is not lab coats, it's researchers' wages. And the amount the NIH could pay its researchers in 2022 was fixed by a law that didn't apply to other funders. Now, as an economist and someone who works for a wage, I can promise you that you can't dodge a broad increase in the cost of living just by refusing to increase researchers' pay. You might get away with it for a year, but in the longer term, you're going to end up with fewer, angrier researchers and significantly less engaging launch presentations. So for now, at least, we're more comfortable tying our measure of buying power to changes in the overall cost of living. One other thing we should be looking at, if we're interested in how much actual R&D we're buying, is purchasing power parity. Basically a special set of exchange rates which adjust for how much further a dollar goes in cheaper countries. This is good news. It tells us that the average dollar of funding is being dispersed somewhere where prices are a little bit lower than in America, which is the benchmark. So we've probably been getting a bit more R&D for our money, especially since these figures aren't great at tracking funding to its ultimate recipients, who are more likely to be based in LMICs. But the final point I want to make in relation to these measurement questions is that a bit more R&D isn't really a thing. We're measuring inputs, dollars or full-time equivalents. But what we're interested in is outputs, products and impacts. In a second, I'm going to talk about the pipeline and how we're charting progress at that level. But in general terms, the news here isn't as good. We can think about the progress of R&D over time as the gradual process of harvesting the lowest hanging fruit. Things like wash your hands after they've been inside a corpse, or this cheese has lasted an unusually long time, and having to climb higher and higher branches as we strip the lower ones bare of simple innovations. Or we can think about it in terms of Bourmont's disease, which, like cabin fever, isn't a real pathogen. It's the idea that activities like R&D that are labour intensive will tend to increase in price faster than the overall rate of inflation. All of which is to say that the long-term trajectory for R&D is probably having to run faster just to stay in one place. Progress will tend to slow down even if funding keeps up with the pace, with the cost of living, which this year it didn't. But with that in mind, one comforting way to interpret a drop in the funding from unexpected inflation is that funders mostly didn't decide to make any cuts. When the UK sharply reduced its public funding while leaving the EU in 2021, it looked like a policy choice, one that would need to be reversed before funding came back to where it was. This time, though, we just assigned lower values to a bunch of mostly fixed long-term grants because they covered less R&D. There are a lot of funders, the Gates Foundation and the EC among them, who are being told they cut funding in 2022 while genuinely believing they did the opposite. And that says good things about their intentions. It's just that things didn't work out the way they planned. You can see this in the sectoral breakdown of the fall in funding. The drop was centred on philanthropic and especially public funders, who mostly write fixed long-term contracts, but it didn't impact the private sector, more on them in a second, who mostly just tell us how many hours their scientists spent on R&D. Now, if this means that reported public and philanthropic funding rebounds in 2023, once funders begin taking higher prices into account, we can relax a little. But it would still mean a year of reduced progress as developers struggled with grants that were no longer enough to pay for the things they were supposed to. In a world where inflation now looks both substantial and unpredictable, it might make sense for funders to index the value of their long-term grants to future changes in the price level, so they don't end up cutting the value of their funding by accident. Let's zoom in a little on that rise in industry funding. It grew by 24 million, 3.9% to 640 million, its second highest level ever. Big pharma companies invested record amounts in dengue therapeutics, salmonella infections, leprosy, mycetoma, hepatitis B. Funding from smaller companies grew even faster once we adjust for some survey dropouts. They provided record funding for dengue and made their first substantial investments in LMIC-focused vaccine platforms. And that lines up with the progress we've seen in the product pipeline. The actual number of products captured in our newly released pipeline database has risen by more than half since 2015, with the shares of products in preclinical development and clinical trials switching over that time, from 56% preclinical and 44% clinical development in 2015 to 40% preclinical and 60% clinical development by 2023. This looks like the way things ought to work. Funders, but mostly the US NIH, threw enormous sums into basic research over the early years of the survey, and that funding has gradually trended down. Now, since 2015, we've seen products progress through early stage development and start entering clinical trials in greater numbers. And that's coincided with and partly been driven by rising industry involvement. Seeing more candidates leaving the discovery stage than entering it over the past 8 years feels a little worrying, but it's not necessarily a problem, as long as we actually have enough candidates to survive the attrition that inevitably comes with late stage trials. But what we don't want is a situation where we exhaust our stock of investigational candidates without addressing every area of unmet need and have to begin the process again. What we're seeing at the moment is a bulge of products in the middle stages of development, and only 8% having made it as far as phase 3. About half the products we captured in the 2019 pipeline had become inactive by 2023, some combination of failed, abandoned, stalled, or unfunded. So what we're hoping to see is that phase 3 figure rise, leading to a faster rate of product launches and also greater involvement from the private sector in taking those candidates to market. Market, though, is a bit of a loaded term when talking about neglected disease. We generally assume an area of unmet need qualifies as neglected only when there's not enough commercial incentive for it to have a working market. Sometimes an area like vaccines for dengue receives significant private investment because of demand in higher income countries or from tourists or from the military. In those cases, we decide that area no longer counts as neglected and we remove it from our scope. So this year's record funding from both small and large pharmaceutical companies from dengue therapeutics is good news for low-income nations where dengue is endemic. But it also makes us worry that something similar to dengue vaccines might be happening, that these investments are being made not despite being unprofitable, but because they no longer are. So there's a delicate balancing act when we celebrate increased private sector R&D in diseases where, by definition, there's insufficient incentive for private sector R&D. Success makes us wonder whether we've correctly defined the problem. In particular, climate change is causing tropical diseases to spread further from the equator, and diseases like Chagas, dengue, and malaria have started displaying community transmission in the US. There have even been several new cases of leprosy in the last year in the United States, apparently transmitted via armadillo wrestling. And to answer the inevitable follow-up questions, yes, this means humans wrestling against armadillos, and yes, this is in Florida. The upshot is that high-income countries are going to start viewing investment in neglected disease as an investment in their domestic health, which implies a big change to how the private sector evaluates the market for, say, its new leprosy treatments. So how do we encourage the spillover of these new products, or commercial markets for issues and in places that still can't support one? Part of the solution is probably just acknowledging that, fortunately, the list of areas that are genuinely neglected will start to shrink as, unfortunately, their diseases start spreading to the rich world. The other part is by trying to make the remaining small, underfunded markets more profitable, by making them cheaper and easier to enter. This means policies like making it easy to conduct multi-arm trials, especially for repurposed products already making money in other areas, and making sure registration and market access for proven products is quick and reliable. Something like cryptococcal meningitis is never going to be a huge money spinner, but we've seen in practice that you can make it look just profitable enough that a company will be willing to run a few extra trials on its existing antifungal to see if it might be able to add a crypto indication alongside the other uses. But as someone who's worked alongside Big Pharma, they want to minimize risk and delay almost as much as they want to maximize profit. So that only happens if those trials are easy to run and if they can rely on actually being able to sell their product if they succeed. Some of the rise in private investment matches this story. Products already registered elsewhere being trialled against neglected diseases because the costs of entry are low. But a lot of the growth in global funding over the past 3 years has looked quite different. It's been in the next generation of therapeutics, large molecule biologics, mostly monoclonal antibodies, or MABs to their friends. Funding for these biologics has more than doubled over 3 years, leaping from 70 million in 2019 to 144 million by 2022. And they're up by a factor of 85 from early last decade. Biologics funding from the private sector in particular rose more than fivefold in 2022 to a record 23 million. Now, in many ways, these large molecule treatments are the opposite of the sort of low-cost repurposed therapeutics I've described as having commercial potential in LMICs. They rely on much newer technologies, as evidenced by their rapid growth, and they can be finicky to produce and distribute at scale. One reason why the impact of costly biologics on COVID was relatively limited. MABs offer real advantages over both vaccines and small molecule drugs. Fewer side effects, prevention as well as cure. But that big increase in funding has gotten us close to MABs for malaria and HIV. But we're still not sure they can solve the scaling and cold chain problems, or whether they'll end up mostly just benefiting high-income countries. And this is a big deal, particularly since we're seeing individual funders and their programs for individual diseases shifting away from vaccines and towards biologics. One area where biologics could provide that kind of proof of concept is with the new long-acting MABs for use against pediatric RSV. These are specifically designed for low-resource settings, and the very young patient population means the required dosages are tiny. Success here would help demonstrate that biologics can deliver real-world impacts in LMICs and make us worry less about funding being diverted from vaccine R&D. Beyond which products deserve more investment, though, is the overarching question of how much R&D funding is ultimately enough. We'd obviously rather live in a world where there was no trade-off between money for vaccines and money for biologics, but we know that funding will never be unlimited. If we're constantly calling for more, we also need to give some indication of when we'd be satisfied. The GFINDER survey allows us to look at how global funding has evolved over time, and our new Compass forward-looking data collection gives us some idea of what might happen in the near future, but neither gives us any normative basis for judging whether funding is, has been, or will be sufficient for LMIC's needs. One option is to compare neglected disease R&D to other vaguely similar pots of money, or to frivolous things industry spends its money on. This tells us something about global priorities, but it doesn't really answer the question either. So instead, we might look at whether current levels of investment provide value for money. This is something we're attempting with our Evidence for Impact project, which is working to estimate the benefits of technologies we invested in between 1999 and 2022. Determining how many lives were saved by new technologies launched over that time is a complex, messy calculation. Figuring out the future impact of products still in the pipeline is even harder. And then putting a dollar value on those gains is a philosophical challenge as much as it is a mathematical one. The early returns, though, are extremely promising. Our current estimates show that every dollar spent on neglected disease R&D yielded well over $100 worth of impact in reduced death and disability. So it's fair to say then that we ought to be spending much more on neglected disease R&D. We're passing up an opportunity to turn every dollar we spend into hundreds of dollars worth of impact. And in 10 years' time, instead of talking about stagnation or decline, it would be nice to look back on a decade-long flood of funding into neglected disease R&D and be able to say that we finally found the resources and the will to take advantage of opportunities to make the world a much better place and at a relatively trivial cost. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I think you've given everyone a lot to think about, and hopefully everyone's brain is buzzing with questions that they want to ask Paul when we turn our attention to that section of this launch event. However, Paul's given us the overview of kind of global health R&D for neglected diseases. And now I want to bring in Shingai to give her personal reflections on what some of the key messages could mean to the broader global health community, and in particular for the African continent. Shingai, over to you.
Thank you so much, Lindsay, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone who's joining us for this launch. I think it's a privilege for me to be here. I have been reading the GFINDER report every year for many years. And in my previous role at EDCTP, we used to contribute data to the GFINDER report every year. So it really is a privilege to be here with you today. And I think it's also excellent timing to be releasing the report just after we celebrated World NTD Day. I think yesterday we spent hours and hours reading lots of different information in our news feeds. And I think this report, as always, provides us with the most up-to-date and informative information that can help to inform decision-making. So I think if I am to reflect on the report, I'll pick on a few key things and put some of my thoughts forward. And the first would be that there is this 10% decline in funding, which I think we automatically would worry about. I think Paul has already described how this was calculated. And of course, it's largely due to inflation. But ultimately, the question is, so what happens with the funding gap, right? Because it means that you have planned, you have, the next 5 years, 10 years, all planned out, how much it's going to cost, and all of a sudden, you no longer have enough money. And I think this is fresh off of COVID, right? We learned this lesson as well during COVID. A lot of clinical trials and work on R&D had to pause when COVID happened. And of course, what this meant is your initially planned clinical trial that would have run and ended at this stage didn't, it stopped, you were still paying salaries, etc. So ultimately, it means then more money is required for you to be able to complete the research at whichever stage that you were. And the question with this 10% decline is who is going to fill that gap? Are the initial investors going to fill the 10% gap to ensure that, their investment is seen all the way through? If they don't, then what is going to happen? Because then it means we're going to have products that are going to be stuck somewhere along in the pipeline because of this deficit. And this may be just this year, but what if there's a compounding drop? And in 2023, we see that there was also an inflation drop, etc. So I think that question, who is going to fund that gap? I think this is something that we need to highlight and bring attention to. The next point that I would like to raise is the decline in the preclinical candidates. depending on how you look at it, right? This is positive. It means that they are progressing through the pipeline, which means they're now in the clinical stages. But if you think about neglected diseases in general, these are the diseases that people don't usually want to fund because they can't make money off of it. So when you look at the spread of where the money is across the different neglected diseases in the report, you can see that there is a very large bias of where investments are going. And so if we have a decline in the preclinical, particularly in the disease areas which are already not funded so well, it means that in the future, there are no candidates that are coming up for those areas. So I think that's also something that we need to watch to say, if there is a decline in the preclinical work, in the discovery work, then it means we can't anticipate that there is going to be any clinical work coming up for these diseases as well. And so we do need to think about that. And I think this is something that's discussed every year, that for various reasons, some disease areas are not attractive for industry or for the private sector. And so what do we do about those disease areas? If you look at the amount of funding that's spent for HIV, TB, and malaria, is the greater proportion, right, of all the R&D funding. And the question would be, instead of funding 15 candidates for TB, could we fund 10 candidates for TB, and that money for 5 candidates could be redirected to look at other diseases? So I think it's really looking at it from a practical point of view. You look at it and you say, if there isn't interest in some of these smaller diseases that are largely affecting people in the global south, if we're not motivating and trying to find funds to ensure that that discovery and preclinical research can take place, then it means the horizon is not looking too bright for those diseases. So that would be the second point. Then the third point is the overall growth of the pipeline by 55% since 2015. And I think that's, again, very positive. And I think I already touched on this shift from the preclinical to the more clinical. But then what is concerning is only 8% of those products have reached phase 3. So it means then you are doing quite well. They're progressing somewhere in the pipeline, but then they're stuck in the middle. And, of course, late stage research is extremely expensive, which is understandable. But I think that 8% is a bit concerning, and we should be thinking about how do we facilitate late stage research better? Are there ways that we can drive down the costs of late stage research in order to be able to reduce the number of products that are sort of sitting in the middle and be able to push them out of the late stage research phase a little bit faster? So I think those would be my initial 3 reflections from the report. And I look forward to discussing more with Lindsay and Paul. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shingai. That's great. And again, added some more food for thought to all of our participants today. So now that we've heard the key findings of this year's report from Paul and Shingai's reflections, we're now moving into the discussion section of the event. And this is your opportunity to put your hand up, ask questions, make comments, share your reflections, initial reactions to some of these key findings. We've had a couple of comments so far, but I'm going to kick things off to dig in a little bit more on the inflation side. So Paul, this year's story, inflation is a very dominant feature. But is this going to be something that is a 2022 phenomenon, or one that we can expect to continue for some time? And I guess just depending on the response to that, what is the potential impact? Are we going to continue to see this downward trajectory?
Yeah, no, it's a fair question. I think I said last year in response to a similar inquiry that if I was that good at economic forecasting, I would have a much more lucrative job and be sipping a pina colada somewhere. But look, I think probably the lengthy period of very low inflation is over, and certainly the period of being able to be pretty sure that inflation would stay low is definitely over. It's certainly more uncertain, even if its average level hasn't necessarily spiked. So look, I think it is a good time to be having this conversation about how to write long-term grants and whether to kind of either allocate that risk to the funder or split it a bit more evenly, I guess, that it's not a nasty surprise that product developers are left with when and if it does happen again. But yeah, it's possible we're now living in a new, scarier, inflationier world, and funding should really adjust, I think, to reflect that change.
And I guess just to follow up on that point, like funders often hear that more money is needed for everything that they focus on in. Why do you think they should take particular heed of this year's GFINDER analysis? And I guess just on the flip side, are there any funders who are already thinking about this and lessons that we can learn from them? And I guess we might not have all the answers here, but keen to hear from our audience as well to see if they've got any suggestions for how we tackle this as a global health community. Paul, was there any reflections on the key messages for funders?
Look, I think I would be really interested to hear what funders have to say. I think that the inflation in 2022 took everyone by surprise, policymakers as well as everyone in the R&D sphere. So I do think it was a genuine surprise. I would be really interested to hear whether this has been tried under previous periods of high inflation, for example, and found not to be a good approach. But it's not something we're aware of, I guess, that it was a shock to us as much as it was to everyone else, I think.
That's great. I see a hand from the audience from Val. Do you want to come off mute and you can ask your question? Val, can you get yourself off mute? No. Let me see. Emmanuel, can you help at all?
It should work now.
Oh.
Okay, now
There
that's
we
worked.
go.
Thank you so much, whoever did
Wonderful.
that. I can answer. I'm from the UK Department of Health and Social Care. I found that inflation issue really interesting, but I would just say, the like devil's advocate response is that obviously I'm imagining that most research funders' budgets around the world haven't increased in line with inflation. So I don't know what else to say really in response, other than it's really interesting to have the analysis. And the second thing I'd say is that what I always say about GFINDER, which I've known for really, really a long time now, and congratulations to the team and to you guys for doing really excellent work as always on this, is that obviously there's a certain that this is looking at infectious diseases, particularly kind of where there is no market, as Shingai says. That is of course a very important section of global health research or research affecting low and middle income country people. But it isn't all. And as we have a portfolio of global health research, we are particularly looking at what we term the shifting global burden of disease. So where there are non-communicable diseases and infectious diseases together, for example. And therefore, not that I want to, I'm a malaria researcher by background and a TB researcher, so my heart is here. But I also really acknowledge that this is, be good in your framing more and more actually to acknowledge that this is part of the health research picture, and that we have specific programs like Global Alliance for Chronic Diseases, etc., which will not be picked up. And even my colleagues say, oh, but this GFINDER report is the report on, all global health research. And I have to keep saying, well, no, it isn't. I know that it sounds like it is, but actually it isn't. And so, much as I'm a super big supporter and champion of what you're doing, I just think even more and more, and Shingai would be well placed to comment on this, more and more to make sure that framing is there, that, the funders that you're talking about may well be investing more and more in some of those other topics, like people with HIV and diabetes. And I know some of that will be captured. Obviously, I know you do an amazing job in unpicking a lot of that, but some of it won't be, where it is looking at mental health issues in a low middle income country or whatever. That won't be captured. So just to make sure the framing is there, that's what I would ask. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Paul or Shingai, would you like to come back at Val with anything?
I guess I would just say, firstly, acknowledge that's an extremely fair point. And I think Terence Scott has made a sort of similar question in the Q&A about whether we look at the public health work associated with improving the delivery of these products. We do have a narrow lens, and I think it's important that we remember that. And maybe we don't say that often enough, but no, it's absolutely the case that sometimes the money that's disappeared is going to other very good things. And because of our narrow lens, we miss that. So no, it's absolutely fair to say we pick a set of diseases and we pick a set of actions, biopharmaceutical R&D to do with those diseases. That's our hobby horse. And I hope we do a very good job gathering that data, but we don't do everything. And we do therefore miss part of the global health story. So no, it's a timely reminder.
Shingai, did you have anything that you wanted to say in response to that?
No, I think Val's point is very valid. But as Paul has explained, every report or every analysis has its limitations. So I think the GFINDER is very good at what it does. We all wait every year to receive this report because we know that we will have clear information about, a certain group of diseases. Agreeably, it's important to know that it doesn't cover everything. And it's a point well taken. And I think in the beginning of the report, there is an explanation of what is the GFINDER report and what it is not. But of course, always good to include this in conversation and remind people of the context or the purpose of the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Shingai. I'm going to come to Joelle Tan next from DNDI. If you can bring yourself off mute.
Yes, hi. I thank you. Congratulations again. We always look forward to these launches and congrats on the analysis. I wanted to hear, maybe can you reflect more on the trends in the split between low-income country and high-income country investments in R&D for neglected disease? Are we seeing a confirming trend of more investments from the Global South?
It's a good question, and I think it's one I can probably remind myself of the answer to. From memory, there's not a huge shift. I think LMIC funding was down a little bit this year. I can give you a better answer in 45 seconds. So perhaps if someone can filibuster briefly, I'll try and answer that question better.
So while Paul is thinking and researching and getting you that answer, one reflection that I guess I wanted to share, and maybe would be great to hear from you, Shingai, is we rely on funders giving us the data for GFINDER. We carry out a survey. We know that it is an onerous task, but we are conscious that that doesn't encapsulate every funder, particularly in low and middle income countries. And so I'd be really interested to hear from yourself, Shingai, or others, how we can capture the missing puzzle pieces there, particularly from low and middle income country funders who are operating in this space, because that is another blind spot for us that we would love to fill.
Thanks, Lindsay. I think the overall answer, which Paul is probably going to come back with, is that there isn't much, of a change. But I think one of the shortcomings, I would say, from the Global South is we don't do a good job at documenting. So a lot of the LMIC governments are contributing. They are funding research. They are funding sites. They are doing work, but you cannot get this information. I think if you go to some of the countries, they themselves don't necessarily have this information ready. And so when you send a survey around, I don't think it's necessary that they don't want to. It's just that the information is not being collected in a routine way. And so it then becomes difficult to be able to calculate and be able to say, for this year, how much did we spend for what? And I think the lesson there is, as we invest in building capacity in low and middle income countries, we shouldn't forget that this element of financing and being able to, plan, forecast, and document well is something that we need to build capacity for. Otherwise, we're never going to have this data. So I think that would really be my take. I think there are some countries that are doing very well. South Africa, Kenya, we know because they have a system that has been running for longer. And so they can tell us more about what they're doing. But I do believe that other governments in Africa and probably other global South countries do have some investments, just may not necessarily be documenting them. Thank you.
Thank you, Shingai. Paul.
I can throw in, yes, that LMIC funding was down slightly more than overall funding, so down by about 13%. So, yeah, slightly worse than the overall trend. Indian funding, India is the single largest source of LMIC-based funding. Some of that reflects our really good contacts in India. Our data, we know, in LMICs isn't as good as in high-income countries. Indian funding remained pretty constant. Brazilian and Mexican funding dropped off in a big way. But more or less, you would say LMICs followed the global trend of declining funding in 2022.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat. How the pandemic accounts for the R&D funding turbulence and how much money might have been redirected towards COVID-19 from neglected disease research that would never have happened because of it. And do you think a future pandemic would cause the same issues essentially?
Yeah, it's a really good question. We found some evidence in past years that COVID funding was kind of capturing some of the R&D funding that would normally go to neglected disease R&D. But that said, we've seen a massive expansion in EID funding, and neglected disease funding hasn't cratered. So like the total pot of money has definitely gotten bigger. It's certainly distracted a lot of attention. And our sense is that this year in particular, the US NIH has pivoted a little bit towards non-COVID EID research. Those budgets are up quite a lot across the board. And its neglected disease funding, even after adjusting for inflation, is down a little bit, is a sense that maybe that's a reprioritization. I think we'd need to dig a bit deeper to say whether that's been a general phenomenon, but less than we expected, I guess, is the initial answer. It does look like the world can mobilize EID response funding without really decimating neglected disease funding. Yeah.
Thank you. I guess I want to pivot now a little bit back to who is funding the neglected disease R&D portfolio. We saw a shift in who is funding it with some reductions, particularly in public funders, but also in philanthropic, and industry sort of bucking a trend with slight increases. I guess it'd be good just to dig into what the impact of that might be from the public sector perspective and also the increase in industry funding. Obviously, industry are great at driving products out there, but will they be available and accessible to those who need them? I guess is the question. So Shingai, I wondered if you've had any reflections on that, particularly thinking about access issues that may be related to that point before we bring Paul back in.
Thanks, Lindsay. Not a very easy question. So I do think that there's a shift, an increase, I think, from industry funding that was seen in 2022. And I think that is definitely interesting. But, the question is, what is the basis of their interest? I'm not quite sure what is determining the shift, because, logic tells us that for many of these diseases, it's generally not an area which is attractive to industry. So it's definitely interesting to see. I think I would like to pick Paul's brain to better understand what is actually the rationale or the cause of industry shifting. And I think, when you then link that to LMICs and then access, you need to think about who is funding the product and what is their intention with that product once it's available. Is their intention to make that product as cheap as possible and as freely accessible to those who need it, or is it a product to make money? And of course, when you're in industry and private sector, it may be leaning more to the latter. And so I think these are the questions that we have to ask and think about, because ultimately the biggest challenge has always been products can come to the market, but depending on how they've been made, for many of them, it takes 10, 20 years before they actually reach the people who needed those products the most. So I think this shift is very interesting. I think we do need to pay attention to it, and then see that if industry is funding these products, what is the plan for this product? And where will it end up? And are we sure that this product is actually going to reach the people who need it? And in most cases, it's in LMICs. I think the interest also is, maybe we'll touch on it a little bit later, but I think, depending on what is happening in the world, right? There's a lot of shifts that are happening, and I think Paul touched on it earlier. And so I think as we go further along the way, due to climate change or whatever other epidemiological shifts are going to happen, you will see that as certain diseases that were not of particular interest start to affect different populations in higher income countries, then the interest is going to increase. And so perhaps industry is picking up on certain diseases because they foresee that these might end up being diseases of relevance within a high income country where they can foresee a market and a good profit share for them. So I guess these are some of the questions that I would put forward. Don't have a straightforward answer, but I think those are some of my thoughts. Thank you.
No, that's wonderful. And it was a very difficult question. So it was purposefully so that we can dig into some of this and get people thinking about it. Paul, was there anything else you wanted to add? We've had another question sort of related to this in the chat about, is there a pattern on what phase of R&D industry is favouring with their funding? Is it earlier, later stages?
So it definitely tends to be clinical development, which is sort of how we slice things. I'm just trying to quickly have a look and see if we can provide a little bit more detail at the actual stage level. But yeah, definitely more towards clinical development, and that tends to be the pattern, I guess, that industry tends to step in relatively late in the product development story and take things the final part of the path.
Absolutely, thank you. Now, we've had some questions also sent through prior to the event when you registered. So I'm going to now turn our attention to some of the more disease-specific questions that we received while Paul is reading up on some things there. And for this, there were two areas that particularly stood out. The first was HIV. And I'm going to call on my colleague, Amelia Hynen, who's our Senior Technical Officer at Policy Cures Research, and get Amelia to tell us a bit more about what's been happening with HIV funding and the pipeline this year. And I think people are particularly interested to know a bit more about HIV vaccines. Amelia, can you tell us more?
Yes, thank you, Lindsay. I'm really happy to talk about HIV at this launch event, sort of shedding a little bit more light on disease-specific changes. So you may have captured in one of the graphs that Paul showed up earlier that funding for HIV R&D targeting LMICs actually fell by 15%, and that's now its lowest level since 2015. Funding is heavily relied on by just 4 funders, so 96% of the funding in 2022 came from just NIH, industry, the Gates Foundation, and USAID. A reliance on such a small number of funders does leave the landscape vulnerable to changes with how these organisations decide to disperse their funding. In terms of the impact on the pipeline and the products that are being developed, that funding drop was actually across almost all product areas, but most heavily on vaccines and microbicides, which fell to their record low funding levels. So for vaccines, that was actually closely tied with changes in the pipeline. So we saw the discontinuation of the most advanced vaccine candidate last year, and funding was tied to that. Reflecting more on the pipeline itself, with that discontinuation and other disheartening failures in the past year for vaccine candidates. There aren't any in phase 3 at the moment, so we need to start looking at what's in phase 2 and phase 1 and prepare for that. So increased funding is needed to prepare for the advancement of those candidates that are coming through as they reach the more expensive development phases. And that can also be said for all of the product types. In terms of the candidates that are in the pipeline in clinical development at the moment, there are actually some really promising candidates that utilize different and innovative technologies to hopefully elicit broadly neutralizing antibodies, which is believed to be the immune response capable of protecting against HIV acquisition. And some of those really interesting ones are T-cell based and germline targeting candidates and mRNA technology as well. If we look at these candidates, some of them require, or at least are being investigated as either 2 vaccines or 2 doses. So that could actually impact on the delivery and LMIC applicability once these hopefully get through to registration. So that's a bit of a highlight on what's been happening overall for HIV funding and on the vaccines. But I'm happy to address further questions either through the chat or via email afterwards as well.
Thank you, Amelia. I think that's given us a lot of food for thought and hopefully addressed the desire to know more about the HIV vaccine space. The other area that we had some interest in was malaria, and I'd like to call upon our analyst, Joelle Tan, who's from the Policy Cures Research team. Joelle, if you can come on screen now. Malaria is another hot topic, especially with the new vaccine approvals for R21. But what's been happening? What did we find in GFINDER this year related to malaria?
Thanks, Lindsay. So malaria funding in 2022 was 603 million, which is actually the lowest that it has been in the past 15 years, which is quite significant. And the fall from 2021 to 2022, it was over 10%. And as has been, I guess, a focus of a lot of the discussion today, a lot of that was due to high global inflation. But it still is the steepest fall in funding that malaria has experienced. And much of that fall, or at least part of that fall, was due to a fall in vaccine funding. So vaccine funding hit a record low of 106 million in 2022. And so it approximately makes up about 1/6 of total malaria funding. And what we've seen over the past 5 years is that vaccine funding has fallen year on year for 5 consecutive years. And I think in one of the graphs that Paul showed earlier, you can see that malaria vaccine funding has had the steepest decline across all the neglected diseases. And so you've got this fall in vaccine funding, and you've also got a fall in drug and basic research funding. But encouragingly, there has been a rise in biologics funding. As Paul pointed to, there is an overall trend of that. But in malaria, in particular as well, I think 2022 levels, it was 14 times that of the levels in 2018, and a 250% increase beyond what was in 2021. And a lot of that is due to funding from the Gates Foundation. So it's not the best news for malaria overall, but there are certainly some encouraging stories in there as well.
Thank you, Joelle. That's really helpful. I've had a couple of comments that I've noticed in the chat. One that I just wanted to pull out. I think there needs to be a more realistic conversation between industry and not profit about what is the end goal and where is the compromise. It needs to be sustainable and reliable for both sides. And I think that's in regards to the industry conversation that we were just having. And I think just switching back now to the Q&A, if I can get that on my screen, we also had a question about, you discussed the transition in funding moving from vaccines to monoclonal antibodies. How does this augment funding to other therapeutic modalities used in low and middle income countries, particularly small molecules? Paul, I'm not sure if we've done that analysis yet. Can you shed any light on that?
No, to be honest. The big trend we picked up is the sort of long-term downward trend in vaccines and the sharp upward trend in drug funding, which we talked about last year, and the even sharper growth in biologics funding. And we saw what looked like specific budget pots being reallocated, I guess, not just that there was an overall trend, but individual funders who used to spend a lot on vaccines now spending more on biologics, and even within their individual disease programs. If they spend a lot on TB vaccines, they're now more likely to spend a lot on TB biologics. So we can see that very clear trend of money looking like it's flowing from vaccines to biologics. As to how that's influenced drug funding overall, so small molecule therapeutics, I genuinely don't know. Overall, there has been significant growth in drug funding, so it doesn't look like the money is disappearing in the way it perhaps is from vaccine R&D.
Yeah, and that was one of the key messages, I think, from last year's report in terms of the increase in the therapeutics funding. So maybe signifying a rebalance after a kind of bigger investment in vaccines, and the kind of rebalancing as we realise we need more products, just not focusing on one modality to not only prevent, but also to treat and cure some of these diseases as well. We are coming towards the end of things now, and I want to just maybe take one more question. And I want to go back to the pipeline. We talked a bit about the shift from early to clinical development, but also the early stage candidates not being replenished. I'm interested to hear from both Paul and Shingai. What does this tell us, if anything, about the focus of global health, the neglected disease R&D? Interested to know your reflections on that. Shingai, can I come to you first on that one, please?
Thanks, Lindsay. So I think the global health R&D space is very complicated. And I think, you know, what GFINDER tells us every year is that there are funders who year on year, you know, give or take some slight increases or decreases, are committed to their investments in these neglected diseases. And I think we know who these are. So I think when it comes to the shift and you now introduce industry, the dynamics become a little bit more complicated, because when it's coming from philanthropy or from the US government, it's quite clear what the intention is, and they're quite predictable. Maybe that's the right word that I would like to use. And so, you know, once you bring in industry, then it's not quite as predictable as you know we would have liked it. So I think there are many factors at play, and I think, you know, we can have a discussion now about what we think is happening, looking at the data from 2022. But if any one of those diseases was for some reason to emerge in the global north, I think that entirely shifts everything. So for me, I think the global health R&D space remains very complex, but I think it's at a point where we are now all accepting, especially after Ebola and after COVID, that things can change. Things can happen much faster, that when there's no money, there can suddenly be money. Of course, it needs to come from somewhere. But I think these are the realities, and we need to have open and frank discussions about them. You know, if, you know, people say if the next pandemic were to come, would this shift money from neglected diseases? Well, the honest answer is it depends where the pandemic emerges and who it's affecting first, right? Because that's going to determine the reaction from the global health community. It's an unfortunate reality, but that is the reality that we're dealing with. So I think we can, you know, talk the science, we can talk the money, we can do the analysis, but I think you need to put it within the right context of saying that there's a lot of global politics at play, and those, unfortunately, are the big pull and push factors within the global R&D space. So I'll stop there, and maybe Paul can add.
Thank you, Shingai. I think that's a really impactful and important point for us all to take away from this event as well. Paul.
Look, I think everyone's heard a lot from me already tonight, and it's very late in Australia. But I guess the final thing I would say is we're really interested in what motivates industry. It's a kind of mysterious black box to us, and their involvement is an incredibly positive trend. We'd want to understand it, so hopefully we can make there be more of it. So I guess that's a call for communication and understanding, I guess.
That's great. And I think on those 2 points, that feels like a great sort of 2 points for key takeaways from this report. Obviously, we've got some reflections to be done on the findings. Inflation is a big issue that we're going to have to grapple with as a global health community. There's shifts in the pipeline, there's shifts in who's funding things. But as you know, Paul and Shingai have just ended on, we need to kind of unpack what that really means. Like, what is the black box of industry and how can we kind of dig deeper into that and have more mature conversations, as was brought out in the chat. And I'm going to end with Shingai's point because I think equity is so important in this dimension. We see the shifts happening. We see how much money can be pulled in to deal with global pandemics. But there is also a mistrust there, given the response that happened with COVID, particularly with a concern that things only matter if they happen in the global north, and we cannot let that happen and be the focus. And as Shingai has said, there's a reality there that we all must take stock of and decide how we want to respond to. So I think that's a great point to end on. I am going to close up this session now and thank the speakers for the wonderful presentations today and conversations that we've had, particularly Shingai, who was our keynote speaker, but also to everyone in the Policymakers research team as well, particularly Amelia, Joelle and Paul for staying up very late to help us with the presentations today. And thank you to all of you for joining and for the questions and the discussion. The Neglected Disease GFINDER report is now live on our website, and our data portal has all 2022 data, not only for neglected diseases, but also for emerging infectious diseases and sexual and reproductive health, which are the other health areas that we also cover. Please do share these resources widely. They're freely available and there for you to use in whichever way you want to. We will also email you the report along with some social media assets with the report's key findings that you can use, and we'd really love to continue these conversations and discussions on Twitter and LinkedIn, so please do feel free to share. If you have any questions, comments, also message us at the email address that was put in the chat before and that Emmanuel can hopefully add in again now. Just before I let you all go, we do have 2 further announcements to make as the Policymakers research team, and we're very excited to share them with you today. First of all, Paul mentioned our very ambitious and exciting project, Evidence for Impact. We will be launching the report on the return on investment of the last 20 years of neglected disease R&D funding by hosting an in-person event in May, which will be on the fringes of the World Health Assembly, so the 28th of May in Geneva. If you're interested to know more about this project and the in-person event, we will be adding to the material that we send you after this event a form that you can sign up to get more information on this. I think there have been a few questions on impact, the business case, return on investment, and the numbers for neglected disease R&D, and hopefully that follow-on project will answer some of those questions. So we look forward to continuing this conversation in May. And the second exciting announcement we have is when we launch this project in May, it will be with a new look and feel. Policymakers research has changed, particularly over the past 3 years. We've been growing and evolving, and it's happened to such an extent now that we think it's time to mature our brand identity. We want to better represent their broader and deeper capabilities that we've been developing. And basically, we want to change the way that our brand comes to life. We want to try and reach more people. We want to try and change more lives with the work that we do. And we want to look at global health R&D with a more human lens. So we're ready to connect with you all in the global health community in a deeper way and to really advocate for the transformative power of science and innovation. So please mark your diaries and look out for what we're doing in May. But I guess rest assured that it's still going to be the same people delivering on the work, just with a bit of a makeover. So more on that to come. And I think I will end there. Thank you all for joining, and we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you very much for your time.